It's a pleasure to moderate this panel about two of the most puzzling and big problems in Indian politics. Um, there's no doubt that, according to democratic theorists and observers of politics all over the world, that India's electoral democracy is historically unprecedented. No country at a low level of income has been able to practice democracy for 70 odd years. That is a historic achievement. However, we also know that a substantial minority of candidates with serious cases of criminality have fought and won elections. And as you'll hear very soon, and we'll come to the cronyism side in a moment, political parties across the ideological spectrum seek such candidates, and voters vote for them despite their knowledge of their criminal record. So that's one puzzling and puzzling feature of Indian polity, which certainly lowers the quality of democracy. Whatever else it does, it certainly lowers the quality of democracy. And it raises two questions. One, why do political parties select criminals as candidates for office? And the second big issue is, why do voters vote for them? The most interesting statistic in Millen's book, When Crime Pays, is that those who have at least one serious case against them are 3 times as likely to win elections than those who have clean record. It is a very remarkable and quite awful statistic at one level, right? And he will tell us, of course, in other words, voters are accepting these candidates, and we need to understand why. The other big issue we are debating today is the role of businessmen and their impact on politics, and the term that James Crabtree has used in his book, The Billionaire Raj, India's New Gilded Age. So let me say a few words about this term, Gilded Age. It was coined in 1873 by Mark Twain, and it was a very prophetic insight. He argued that America's imminent prosperity, American rise began after the Civil War, and the period until 1900 was a period of very high growth, but very high corruption and very high inequality. And he argued that that United States was glittering on the outside, but was rotten in its core. And he was in particular mentioning the rising corruption, not criminality, rising corruption in American democracy. And then, of course, we noted by 1890 that the first dollar billionaires of the world were born anywhere. The first dollar billionaires were the Carnegie, Rockefeller, and I think J.P. Morgan. But the others also, around the same time, who burst on the scene as billionaires and started having an impact on politics, which required a lot of cleaning much later. And James, in his book, The Billionaire Raj, makes the claim that the Gilded Age political economy of the United States, late 19th century United States, is that phenomenon, that term, that concept, and is applicable to what happened in Indian political economy since 2000. India has gone through a Gilded Age with intertwined lives of businessmen and politicians, and his book is about the intertwined lives of criminals and politicians. And so this is the two intertwined lives being discussed on this panel. So what we will do is as follows. We will give them each 5 minutes to summarize their books. Then we'll have a 15-minute discussion between us. That will leave us with 15 minutes of Q&A for the audience. And I think it's very important to have audience participation. And that's how we'll split our 45 minutes. So let's begin with James Crabtree. James, your 5 minutes on the Billionaire Raj.
Very good. Thank you very much for having me. Can you hear me at the back? It's delightful to see such a left-leaning audience. I'm not sure the right is clearly not so strong in India as I'd thought when the sun's beating down on it. So thank you very much for having me. Thank you for that generous introduction. It's a great pleasure to be back here in Bangalore. I was the Financial Times bureau chief in Mumbai from 2011 to 2016, but I used to come here a lot to cover the tech industry and various other things. It's a great pleasure to be back in an Indian city that actually has nice weather. Also to be on a stage with two of the thinkers who influenced my own work. So my book, which is available for sale at the back, has a lovely purple color and is an excellent companion to Milan's book, is about the rise of India's new super wealthy. So it charts the course of what happened from the mid-2000s until now, the extraordinary increase in the number of billionaires and wealth concentration at the top of Indian society. But for the purposes of this section, this conversation, the middle of the book digs into the intricate relationship between business and politics, crony capitalism, the collusion between the business and financial elite. It's actually quite a good book for a Bangalore audience because it's rich in southern and particularly Karnatakan characters. The second chapter is about your city's most famous business son, Mr. Vijay Mallya, and it gave me the single story in the book that has gone on to be most re-quoted by others, which was, so the second chapter in the book is about going to visit Mr. Mallya in London, in exile, poor man, suffering in a very substantial mansion on the edge of Regent's Park. And as both Milan and Ashu have heard me say before, one of my rules of thumb as a journalist was wherever you go, whoever you get to interview, always visit the toilet. Tells you something very interesting about the way an institution, be it a government department or a central bank or a large company, treats their workers if you go and visit, you know, the bathroom. So midway through a 4-hour conversation with Vijay Mallya, he was drinking whiskey. I don't drink, so I was drinking water. And I asked to relieve myself, and so I went to visit his bathroom, which turned out to be entirely golden. He had a golden toilet roll holder, not golden toilet paper. But the story of Vijay Mallya and his golden toilet has since sort of been picked up more than anything else from the book. But even beyond Mr. Mallya, I dig into the iron ore scandal that happened here in Karnataka, which was one of the great examples of crony capitalism. I think you mentioned that in your book in passing as well, Milan. The Reddy family wedding provides one of the bits of color later in the book. So there's plenty of meat for a Karnatakan audience. I mean, I suppose what I would say to try and kind of bring this up to date, because I tell the story of the cronyism that began to emerge in the mid-2000s and sort of through the election of Narendra Modi, and obviously the book, I finished writing it last summer, so it hasn't caught up with the latest developments. But there was a sense when I was writing this that Narendra Modi and his election, the optimists thought that, in a sense, crony capitalism in India, this was kind of an artifact of history. It was something that was a relic of the UPA. Modi was sort of reading the Riot Act to the tycoons, and things were going to get better. And I never really believed this was going to be the case. And although I don't really celebrate this, except in the self-interest that it provides for a book author, it doesn't surprise me in a sense that cronyism appears to be having a renaissance in India at the moment. So you have the scandal over the jets. You have IL&FS. There's a bunch of different scandals that have come out over the last few months. And crony capitalism, I think, is going to be one of the central, if not the central, dividing line between the two parties in the next election. It's going to be interesting to see if Mr. Modi, having been battered in the press over the jet scandal, is going to try and reclaim the ground that was so essential to his victory in the preceding development. One of the stories, I can see one of your city's more famous business sons here, Manish Sabharwal, sitting in the front. One of the more interesting chapters in the book, chapter 7, came from an insight which Manish gave me about the relationship between crony capitalism and economic growth here in the south of India, where there's lots of corruption, but also a far more efficient kind of corruption in Andhra Pradesh, in Tamil Nadu, here in Karnataka. And so in a sense, I don't think you should have ever expected that crony capitalism was going to be a passing phase. The question is, as happened in America over a 40, 50-year period, how do you begin to plan now to introduce the sort of systems that can gradually reduce the incidences of corruption and collusion in your economy? And then, as you become a middle-income country, then you get to a more prosperous place. And let me leave it at that. That's probably my 5 minutes, and I'll hand over to Milan.
Milan, your 5 minutes. But just for the record, the cleaning up of American political economy began with Teddy Roosevelt. So that's 1900 onwards. It took roughly 30 years to do the first act of, to perform the first act of cleaning. And then the crony capitalism of America returns, then the next act of cleaning, etc. And now it's argued once again that arguments have been made, even by intellectuals such as Paul Krugman, that America is slipping back into another Gilded Age under Trump. At any rate, the point here is that it takes quite long to clean up. Quite long to clean up. It's not going to happen in 5 years, in 5 years of Modi's rule. It's not easy to do these things. Milan.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Ashu. I must apologize because I don't have any great toilet anecdotes for you, so I'll skip the toilets. I think most people in this audience are probably familiar with the statistic that roughly 1/3 of elected members of parliament face criminal cases at their time of their nomination. And that 20%, 1/5, face not just any old case, but a serious case, that if a conviction were obtained, this would merit real jail time. And the story is fairly similar at the state level as well. As Ashu began, this presents something of a paradox for democracies, right? There's centuries of democratic theory which suggest the great thing about democracies compared to authoritarian regimes is that if they're public representatives who betray the public trust, that voters can use the ballot box to chuck them out. So what does it mean about the state of Indian democracy that far from chucking them out, voters are actually electing them and re-electing them in quite significant numbers? The analogy that I think is applicable in this case and that I flesh out in the book is that, politics sort of function like a market. And any market has a supply and demand, right? And where supply and demand meet, there's some equilibrium, and that's where the market price is. So what are the supply and demand factors that drive criminality in India? On the supply side, why is it that parties kind of inject this kind of criminality into the mainstream? The short answer is money. Politics have become excessively expensive. We know that the costs of elections are rising. Constituencies are growing in size. Political competition is intensifying. The expectation of handouts is growing. So parties face a kind of fiscal crunch. But they don't want to dedicate themselves to the hard work of building lasting party structures. So therefore, they're out for rents. Money they can bring in with doing the least amount of work possible. So they are sort of thrust into the embrace of self-financing candidates. Candidates who can pay for their own campaign costs. Candidates who can pay parties for the privilege of running. Candidates who can subsidize other candidates who maybe don't have enough funds. One important demographic over here which has money and liquid sources of money are criminals. People who are engaged in some kind of criminal activity. Now, you may be thinking there are a lot of people in India with a lot of wealth, right? It's not restricted to criminals. You have industrialists, you have celebrities, you have film stars, and so on. So what is it that is leading the criminals to do so well? And that's, I think, where you have to bring in the voters. That's where you have to bring in the demand side. That in many parts of the country today, the rule of law is simply weak or non-existent, which means the government is not seen as an impartial or effective arbiter of the basic things we think states should do. Provide security, arbitrate disputes, adjudicate disputes, provide basic public services, social insurance. And in those places where the rule of law is weak and where social divisions of caste, of religion, of ethnicity are quite rife, criminal candidates essentially could use that interaction to cast their criminality as a sign of their credibility to get things done for their particular constituency, for their particular vote bank. And so what this means from a larger kind of meta standpoint is this is not about illiterate, ignorant voters. that voters often have information about who their politicians are, and yet they're voting for them because of their criminality, not necessarily in spite of their criminality. So from a policy standpoint, if we're interested in tackling this challenge, it's not simply about increasing voter awareness, civic education, getting media involvement, because if you have a gunda who you've elected, you probably know that that person is a gunda, and you're voting for him or her for other reasons. The solution, and this is why it's really a generational challenge, is about governance. And I think this is where James and I kind of converge, is that it's some of those basic attributes of the state that we think of as kind of core sovereign functions that are missing, and that's what allows this gap to be created.
So we have now a summary of the arguments. To repeat, James is arguing that Indian political economy is going through a phase which roughly every agrarian economy that rapidly urbanizes, industrializes, goes through. This is a larger claim. India is simply an example of a tendency that has been widely witnessed in history. And the claim that Millan is making is that's of a different kind. Criminality, the role of criminals in politics, it's not, perhaps he would say something about that. The comparative evidence on that is not that at some stage in the evolution of democracy, criminals necessarily get involved, right? So let's start this conversation about what do we know from comparative experience of democracies. So that's a question for you. Comparative experience of democracies about the involvement of criminals in democratic politics.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think there are many countries in the world where we do see criminals active. Take the case of Brazil, take the case of Nigeria, take the case of Indonesia, and
Italy.
And Italy, and of course countries at various stages of their history. I think there is something unique about India, and you can trace this through the evolution of Indian political history, which is there were criminals who were active in the 1950s and the 1960s in politics. But they typically occupied the periphery rather than the center stage. So the Congress Party would rely on them at the time of the elections to mobilize voters, to suppress voters, to hand out freebies. But over time, as the state weakened and as competition grew, these criminals decided, I have the resources, I have the clout, and political competition is now very uncertain. I can't go to sleep at night knowing that the Congress will be back in the morning. So therefore, I want to take my fate into my own hands. So we see a process beginning in the 1970s, ramping up after the emergency, where they went from the periphery to the center stage. And I think in many democracies, the criminals are on the outskirts. They're the kingmakers, they're the godfathers, and they are backing political candidates. But there is much less uncertainty about the electoral game. Right? I mean, just to give you a comparative statistic, in the United States, which we think of as a competitive democracy, the average margin of victory in a congressional race is 37%. That's the difference between the winner and the runner-up. Okay, the average margin of victory in an Indian election, a Lok Sabha election, is somewhere between 10 and 15%. So orders of magnitude more complicated, which I think changes the calculation.
Yeah, and was there any stage in American democracy, any phase of American democracy where criminals were involved in running for office?
I mean, you did see some of this, what I would call blue-collar criminality, but as far as we know, not in the same kinds of numbers. And I think it also has to do with the very real weaknesses. See, the weakness of the rule of law in India both creates the vacuum for these people to provide a service or a good, but it also kind of ensures that they can act with impunity, that there's very little chance that that case which is against them, their origin of their criminal activity, will result in some kind of judicial conviction. And we all know in this audience the big weaknesses and the infirmities of the judicial system, even in a best case scenario, it could take years, if not decades, for an ordinary case to reach its logical conclusion.
And James, for you, perhaps the starting question would be, there are surely some sectors of Indian economy which are not rent-thick. There are rent-thin sectors, there are rent-thick sectors. The rent-thick sectors would be natural resources, real estate, where the possibility of deriving illegitimate benefits through government business collusion would be very high. That's rent-thick. So would your argument, how would your argument apply to rent-thin sectors, and what are the rent-thin sectors according to you?
So this is one of the criticisms that's been made of my book, which is, in a sense, it's very unfair because it only focuses on the bad guys. And there are lots of good guys. You have Nandan Nilekani coming this afternoon, plenty of good billionaires out there. And I think, that's completely right. In a sense, I wanted to write a book about what was interesting, and the characters in the book are the interesting guys. They also happen to be the bad guys. So in that sense, it's guilty as charged. A more interesting question, I suppose, is, so you gave a very elegant summary of the argument in the book, which is that India is going through a stage that is very similar to one that lots of other countries, both in the industrialized West, but also in Eastern Asia, have gone through. And I suppose the question is, what is new, what is different about India, and what is the same? And so that's kind of what you're poking at. So to take a local example, and one that is in Milan's book as well, so the iron ore scandal here in Karnataka, one of the things that's different about India is that it's going through this transition in an era of massive globalization. And so the iron ore scandal that happened here and in Goa in the middle to the late 2000s and came to light after that was partly a kind of function of things that were going on domestically, but it was also part of a much bigger international story. And in a sense, that's where I start my account, that a lot of what happened in India in the mid-2000s was a function of the re-engagement that India had with globalization. So why did the iron ore scandal happen? It happened because of the Beijing Olympics. The Beijing Olympics kicked up demand for steel in China and elsewhere. You had the commodity super cycle. That meant iron ore prices went through the roof. That meant lots of people suddenly thought, okay, we should dig up a lot more iron ore. And the Indian state, which is, again, where Milan and I both end our books, the capacity of the Indian state to cope with a sudden huge increase in demand for that particular commodity simply wasn't there. And so everything kind of broke down, and in the end, the only way it got solved was by the intervention of the judiciary, saying, all right, shut the whole thing down until we figure out what to do with this. And gradually, I mean, you've seen this happen in all sorts of industries. We even saw it happen in cricket, where effectively it was the same story, that there was kind of rounds of some sort of poor behavior in governance, and in the end, the legal system stood in and said, stop, that's enough. And so to some extent, you can always find ways that India is going to be different. It's happening in a more global era. It's a very big country. It's an ancient country rather than a relatively modern creation. Nonetheless, this pattern that you saw in the United Kingdom and the United States, and you saw across Eastern Asia, that you said very nicely, the movement from a predominantly agrarian rural economy to one that is middle income and industrial and then onwards and upwards, is common across a lot of countries, and that's a reason for optimism. It suggests, in a sense, that although you might look at some of the behavior of India's political class or some of its less savory tycoons, and you might think that this is somehow innate to this country or insoluble, actually neither of those things are likely to be true. That with progressive political reform of the sort you see in other countries and of the sort that Milan recommends in his book, then you can make relatively quick progress, over a 20, 30, 40-year period.
One more question for you before we go to Milan. So the cleaning up in America begins with Teddy Roosevelt, and during his 7-8 years, quite a lot was done. A number of people argued when Modi rose to power that, to put it somewhat dramatically, that's not the exact argument made, but the spirit was the same, that he would be India's Teddy Roosevelt. He would clean up business, right? He would crack the whip. And a number of businessmen, certainly in Mumbai, would say he's cracking the whip, right? So the idea that there's a billionaire Raj, that billionaires are determining or have captured the state, they would argue is not true of Modi, that he has cracked the whip. And he could be viewed, therefore, as some kind of Teddy Roosevelt. Your remarks?
So Ashu is being very modest because almost the very idea for the book that I wrote, I borrowed from him and Jayant Sinha, the now BJP government minister. They wrote an article in the Financial Times in 2011, which was one of the more popular examples of this comparison. So in a sense, you can blame him for all of this. Jayant Sinha actually did make that comparison. I mean, as a BJP loyalist, he said, Modi is our Teddy Roosevelt. He is going to clean up the system. And so I suppose as a recovering journalist, I try to be balanced in all of this. And I think it is fair to say that if you were to go back to 2008, there was a real sense that the political economy of India was being controlled by the kind of corporate elite, and that politicians were frequently to be found in the pockets of some of these big tycoons, and that is less so now, and that's partly due to Modi, and that's something rather positive that has happened on his watch. Now, does that mean that the sort of ordinary people, the incidents of kind of your experience of bribery, or the political funding system has been cleaned up, or that there are no more crony capitalism scandals? I mean, not really. So the Modi record on this, particularly, I suspect we're going to get on to the issue of political funding, where the BJP government has done very little. So he has done some good things, but I think if you're going to compare him to a true reformer, particularly one who was famous for his taking on of entrenched corporate power, and so Teddy Roosevelt was part of the movement for trust busting and removing large monopolies, and in a sense taking head on entrenched corporate power. I can't say that you've seen something similar to that under Modi, much as he has been trying to get Mr. Malia back from London and has not yet succeeded.
So this then leads us to campaign finance rules, because I think one of your central claims in the book, and this is something on which Milan also should comment, one of your central claims in the book is that campaign finance is very murky in India. Businessmen basically finance campaigns, and often illegally, and they then expect returns, and they want favorable contracts from the government. And so the changes in campaign finance rules, introduction of bonds, according to you, does it start the cleaning up process, or it's completely marginal? And for you, the question would be, what are its implications, if any, for crime in politics? The changes in the campaign finance rules. So let's start with, yeah.
So if you think about electoral bonds, right, essentially what they do is they provide a mechanism whereby corporations or individuals can give to political parties through the banking system, so not in cash, but they essentially legitimize the opacity which exists in the current system. So businesses do not have to disclose that they've given X amount of rupees to a political party, and nor does that political party have to report that they've received this from that particular business. Now, I don't think that this advances the ball in the direction that we want to go. I think the push that we really want to make is towards greater transparency. It's somewhat ironic, in my view, that the government introduced this proposal under the heading of enhancing transparency. And so the question you have to ask is transparency to whom? If you take the iron ore example that James has brought up, and you go to Karnataka, or you go to Goa, and there's an iron ore company which decides to give 100 crores to the BJP or to the Congress. And then once that government comes into power, decides to give them some favors. There is no way that you, nor I, nor the media, nor civil society, nor anyone really will be able to connect those dots. Because now you've essentially legitimized that that can happen underground. So I don't think this actually changes all that much when it comes to money or to criminality, I'm afraid. And the danger I fear is that we've ticked the box. We feel like we've done the change, and now it will be that much harder to kind of move the ball in a positive direction.
And James, sort of slight reformulation that for you. Would your claim be that until a serious reform of campaign finance is undertaken in India, Mr. Modi cannot be a Teddy Roosevelt? campaign finance is the heart of the problem.
Campaign finance is sort of the original sin of Indian democracy. Now, that's not to say I think, you know, American democracy is a complete mess at the moment, and so I'm not, and neither would anyone else be claiming that this is a sort of perfect model. But at least in the American system, even though you have, you know, an insane relationship between money and political objectives, at least roughly you know who's giving money to whom, and therefore if there is a kind of quid pro quo, someone appears to be getting favors, then you can kind of reasonably assume why that might be. Now, that's not a great system. It's not Denmark or Finland or, you know, Taiwan, countries that have kind of much more progressive and cheaper systems of government. But it's better than the one that India has now. And yeah, I mean, I think basically it's not possible to imagine, or not in my imagination, that India is going to become like a small European social democracy with state funding of political parties and most money being given by small dollar donations. I mean, I think in the end, this is a big, expensive democracy. The figure that most people quote for the last election was $4 or $5 billion, nose to tail. So the next one is going to be much more expensive. And I think I would be, Milan is polite about this. I mean, I think the BJP has done nothing about this because it's the principal beneficiary. I mean, it has most of the relationships with the prominent business houses. And so this is a kind of game theory problem. Now, that's not to excuse the Congress, because they also were, you know, everyone is playing this system, and you have a kind of game theory problem, which is the government primarily wants to win power the next time. Modi's main political objective is, you know, driving a stake through the Congress party legacy and ensuring the BJP is the natural party of government. He's got to win elections. To do that, he has to play in this increasingly expensive field where you have to, you know, buy expensive television ads, and as Milan's book shows, you have to hand out an awful lot of money in bribes. For that, you need money, so you have no incentive to change the system. And so, you know, that's been true in America as well. I mean, in the end, the moments of trying to reform this are very difficult, and so I presume this will only be reformed in some moment of kind of crisis and public disgust. In which the people somehow come together and say, you know, enough of this, we need some form of campaign finance reform. But until you get there, it is going to be very difficult to make transparent and open the relationship between business and politics.
Just 15 seconds.
Yeah, actually more than that. I think you before we came on stage, you were saying something about not only the impact of billionaires or their role in campaign finance, but also smaller businessmen, or what you call the meso level, not this very high top, but somewhere in the middle is a problem too.
Yeah, I think that's where I maybe disagree slightly with James, who focuses on sort of the big fish. That my own research and with the work of others on campaign finance suggests that, you know, the bulk of the money is not being generated necessarily by the big Mumbai conglomerates. It's what TN9 and the journalist calls the mezzanine level, right? So these are builders, these are infrastructure guys who are operating at the state and local levels who really have a stake in ensuring that their licenses, permissions, and clearances go through, and therefore they become the funders. And there are many, many more of them, and they're distributed, you know, across the country.
Liquor barons.
Liquor barons, yeah, exactly.
Naming no names.
But just one thing on the American system, I'm afraid that, someone who's based in Washington, the one advantage we used to have, which was, yes, there was a hell of a lot of money, but you kind of knew where it was going, we are now retreating from that as well. So the advent of dark money, the opaque nature of campaign finance is only going to grow. And so I'm afraid, in a funny way, the American system and the Indian system could actually converge.
Okay, one last question before we go to the audience. If you describe democracy as a political marketplace, which has supply and demand rules, criminals, you're saying there's demand for them because they solve problems quickly and the state is stuck. Supply is partly driven by this demand, and partly that criminals are able to self-finance their elections. They don't depend on political resources of the political party to run for office. Now, if people like criminals so much because they deliver in a system which is stuck, which is unable to deliver, right, and they get things done, if that's the case, why did the 2014 election only had 21% MPs with criminal background? Why not 50%? So, right, so how do you get this equilibrium around 21% or 19% or 18%? Why not more?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way to think about the market is that it's not one wholesale market, right? It's hundreds, if not thousands, of individual markets, where the contextual factors of the weakness of government, the salience of those social divisions, varies incredibly across the length and breadth of India. And so therefore, in some constituencies, in some states, either one of these factors is less or more important. It could also be the case that in some places, frankly, elections just aren't as expensive for historical reasons, for cultural reasons. And so therefore, it has not taken over the whole country. But the worry is that in many parts, I think for middle class or the Aam Aadmi, joining politics is sort of a four-letter word, right? It's associated with now a negative connotation, and so that the worry is that the greater number of bad apples that you have, it's going to progressively drive out the good apples, and I think that's a real concern.
Okay, so I think let's open up for lovely. So many hands up. I suppose there are volunteers here with the microphones. So let's start. Let me see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Wow. Okay, let's. So clearly, the question has to be brief, or the comment has to be brief. Sir, can we go next to you? Okay, and then we come here. We'll come to you. Yes. Could you also identify yourself in them?
My question is, what is the women demography of the criminal 21%? Like how many women, how many men do you, in the 21% of the criminals who are participating in the elections?
Are you asking, are women criminals also running for office?
Yes, and is it an increasing graph with the women empowerment? Like there are more women.
I couldn't hear.
So the question, Milan, is what is the gender disaggregation of criminals? Are there women also criminals and running for office and winning?
So the short answer is it's almost entirely a male problem. So the solution is to elect more women in this country. Now, the sad news is that only 8.4% of parliamentary candidates are women, and that 11% of Lok Sabha MPs are women. So I think all of us in the next election need to move that number up.
I'd say the same for my book as well. Almost all the characters in my book, these dodgy billionaires, are men. But I do have a long chapter on Jayalalitha. So again, a southern politician holding the end up, sir.
Can you? Yes, sir. Yeah, and then we'll come to this side. Yeah.
This question is for James, and I'm sorry if I disappointed you. You were probably expecting more questions from a left-leaning audience. But first of all, congratulations on your absolutely engrossing and captivating book. But,
that's very kind. More questions like this.
Yes. But I'm trying to correlate the basic theme in your book with your recent article in the Milken Review, which you wrote in July. And when you had hypothesized or tried to prove that in early developing economies, the disparity between inequality and wealth creation always follows a modeled pattern. But if you look at the billionaire Raj and your narrative there, India is kind of an anti-pattern to this Kudzin's curve that you have kind of emphasized in your article. So do you think that despite the challenges and the stereotypes, India will continue to grow with all of this political influence and wealth inequality distribution?
Let me deal with this very, very quickly. So as I said, one of the main themes in the book is about rising inequality in India. And my argument basically is this is a bad thing. It's been one of the more controversial claims because there have been various people who have pushed back against this. But I think in a sense India follows quite a common pattern that typically early industrializing economies become more unequal, not always, and it's not a kind of uniform law. The problem that India faces is it's much more unequal now than it was 10 years ago. and it's much more unequal than most countries that became rich very quickly in Eastern Asia managed. And so that, I think, is something, whether you're on the right or on the left, politically, as well as in this audience, that people should continue to care about.